Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Absurd Scripture Week 3. We have so thoroughly enjoyed diving into these passages, and we thank you for joining us again for Week 3. This week, it is Judges 14, 5 through 9. This is a very unfamiliar passage. The absurdity here is a little bit more subtle, and it's surrounded by a lot of not so subtle absurdity, and we'll dive into that. So now we invite you to hear this word about Samson from Judges 14, 5 through 9.
Samson went down to Timnah, together with his father and mother. As they approached the vineyards of Timnah, suddenly a young lion came roaring toward them. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him in power, so that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands, as he might have torn a young goat. But he told neither his father nor his mother what he had done. Then he went down and talked with the woman, and he liked her. Sometime later, when he went back to marry her, he turned aside to look at the lion's carcass. In it was a swarm of bees and honey, which he scooped out with his hands and ate as he went along. When he rejoined his parents, he gave them some, and they too ate it. But he did not tell them that he had taken the honey from the lion's carcass.
Okay, so this takes place, scholars believe, somewhere around the time of 1150 BC. To give you perspective, it's the time after Moses and Joshua, but the time before the monarchy and Saul and David and Solomon. So it's kind of in this area where there's sort of a series of kind of regional chieftains they call judges, but they're basically rulers, and Samson is one of those, the most famous of those, in fact. And he's a judge around the time where there's a particular rivalry going on between the Israelites and the Philistines. It's a rivalry, if you've studied the Old Testament before, that I'm sure that you're aware of. It's a rivalry that I would say it's similar to Hatfield-McCoy, but that would be too gentle. It's actually much more violent than that. And while it's an established rivalry at this point, it is still budding. It is deepening. This rivalry is through this story, and we're going to talk more about that in a moment. So, Susanna, before we can tackle today's passage, what led to Samson traveling down this road to begin with?
Okay, I want to take that kind of in with two meanings, if I may. First of all, yes, he's traveling a literal road. He's of marrying age. He wants to find a wife, and he has it in his head that he needs to find a Philistine wife. So he crosses the territory line between Israel and or Dan and the Philistine territory, and he heads toward a place called Timnah. And the other kind of meaning to this in terms of the road that he's traveling is that we need to understand something that about Samson. Even before he was born, he was set apart and consecrated to God. He's a Nazirite. One of the ways that you know a Nazirite is by the fact that they never have their hair cut. That plays into the story later on, not in this part of it, but that's a symbol of being a Nazirite. But his parents dedicated him to God's work. And in a way, he's walking away from that by wanting the Philistine bride, a bride that's not one of his own clan. That's problematic too. So he's entering into dangerous territory by going into the Philistine area. He's also entering into dangerous territory spiritually by, in a way, seeming to reject the fact that he is consecrated or set apart to God. So there's trouble brewing, and some of that trouble comes in the form of a lion. He encounters a lion as he's traveling this road, and God gives him the strength to tear that lion apart. And so we're getting an example of what Samson can rise to in terms of his strength, his God-given strength.
So this is a very complicated passage or a very complicated story. In fact, the whole Samson story is very complicated, but Samson himself is not a complicated character. Yet in this passage, there's a lot of subtleness. Some time passes and he's traveling back down that road and he sees this lion that he killed. He sees the carcass of the lion. And inside of that dry hide, when there's no trees in that area, and there weren't any trees in that area, sometimes bees will actually, instead of having a hive in a tree, they'll actually use the carcass of an animal, makes for a good hive. He notices there's a beehive in there. He reaches in, he pulls out a big ton of honey, he eats it, breaking God's rule. You're not supposed to eat food from a carcass. Of course, we know now he doesn't care about God's rules as much, but he takes that honey and he eats it. And that is our passage today. It's a little subtle absurdity in that why include this in here? Why have the honey there? Well, in the verse preceding this one, it says that God is using his infatuation with this Philistine woman for a higher purpose. God is up to something here, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. But also more than that, if you were to kind of separate yourself from the context of this passage and just sort of look at it as a story, this is a kind of a common theme throughout Scripture. This idea, and I love the imagery, pulling honey from a lion. I think all of us, no matter what our social class is, no matter if we're in the working class or the retired class or the I don't know, the wealthy class or whatever, no matter if we're living in cities or suburbs or whatever we're doing, we all have these kind of mythical lions that we have to face in some form or another. And I think all of us can come back sometime later and look at the carcass of that lion. Maybe it left some scars. Maybe it took a heavy toll on us. Maybe we're still feeling the impact of that lion, but all of us can reach into those past memories and scoop out some honey, and scoop out some sweetness. And God gives us the ability to do just that, because when our story is read in the context of the biblical story, in the context of God's overarching story in our lives, it brings these moments meaning. And we're all able to kind of scoop out some honey from these past memories, from these past moments of destruction. So jumping back into the context of the passage, though, he's on his way and he's at a big party, and he's getting close to marriage, and he tells a riddle, and the riddle, there's a bet to the riddle, but the riddle is this: out of the eater comes something to eat, out of the strong comes something sweet. He is referring to getting honey out of a carcass. It's not fair, though, because they are unfamiliar with this event. But what's on the line is like all of these clothes and all of these garments. And so, long story short, the people who are trying to answer this riddle convince his soon-to-be wife, hey, can you convince him to tell you, and then you tell us so that we can win the riddle. They threaten her by threatening to kill her and her father. That's what she does. They find out the answer. He gets very angry. He kills 30 men to steal their clothes to pay off the bet. And this sets off a chain of events, a very violent chain of events that are eventually leading to more liberation for the Israelites and the destruction of the Philistines. And there are many instances in the Bible where God steps into this rivalry and sort of steps in the weight a little bit to go in the Israelites' favor so that they can win. Later on, this is absurd. He ties 300 foxes together in pairs and then puts a torch between their tails, and they run around the fields and they burn all the fields of the Philistines. And then he kills 1,000 men with the jawbone of an ass. And then this sets up a chain of events where he just goes on a rampage against these Philistines. And this is God's purpose. This is a little bit of the sweetness that was being foreshadowed. God was up to something here. And that's not always a pleasant thing in the Old Testament to hear about violence, but in light of the overarching message of the Scripture, we can say, well, there's a lot of things. I mean, the year 2020 is one where we could say, hey, that was a pretty tough year. But what was God up to last year? Where's the sweetness and all of that chaos and all of that destruction? And so, Susanna, help us out here. How is this particular story significant to the overall arc of Samson's narrative?
I think that, as you said, there is a lot that goes on here. Thank you very much for drawing out a challenge for all of us, to look at this past year, to look at the pandemic, and to see what sweetness we can draw out of it. I'm going to also thank you for bringing that perspective to it as well. You're right. It's hard to look at the story of Samson. It's hard to appreciate God being at work in the midst of these violent episodes. It's hard to see God at work when Samson seems to be not thinking with wisdom, not using discretion, not or totally disregarding the call and claim on his own life. And this happens more than once. It's a story. It's repeated. This one bride that he had, and then when we read about Delilah in the 16th chapter, if you want to read kind of the whole arc of the Samson story, yeah, it's hard to walk through the violence of this, the self-centeredness of it. But if we're doing it as you're suggesting, that we're always thinking about what's God's purpose here, what can God draw out of this, and how is Samson being set up to be the hero of God's story? Ultimately, he is the hero of God's story, and God's purpose gets worked out, and so I think that's important to us. I think three things that I've kind of drawn from the Samson story is, the first is the challenge. What is the purpose that God's working out in our lives? What are we doing to discover what it is that God is calling us to? Not just the work, our livelihood, but what is it that God's purpose for our lives? Because we each are set apart, consecrated to God in baptism. The other thing is, there is evidence of God's great strength beyond what we have as human beings. I think there are many times in our lives that we have to rely on God's strength, to trust that God will provide the strength we need, especially when we're facing challenges. And that's the third thing. We're always going to be facing challenges. No one would have dreamed the challenge that we had with the pandemic and how that would affect our lives personally, corporately, nationally, internationally. Who would have thought? There are going to be challenges, and we know that. We tell each other the stories of the challenges that we've had in our lives. The other thing is that sometimes we're our own worst enemy. Samson clearly shows that with some of the decisions that he makes. He puts himself into danger. He gets himself into trouble, He sometimes focuses too much on a lot of times he focuses too much on his own needs, and not on God's call and claim on him. So I think thinking about God's purpose for our lives, thinking about and being grateful for the strength that God provides us, and also accepting the fact that the challenges along the way will be there. They'll be real. But maybe we can draw some honey, some sweetness out of them.
Well said, Susanna. Thank you so much. And thank you for listening. This has been week 3 of Absurd Scripture, and we certainly had our fair share. We had several absurd stories all packed in one today. So we invite you to return next week for week 4, and we look forward to seeing you then.